Hey everyone, I hope you're doing great and you're following the 3 H's of the channel. In this video are a collection of stories from a family that had some terrifying experiences on their ranch. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, pull up a stump with me and let's get into it. Thank you for watching. I grew up on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. We had plenty of neighbors, but our ranch was the deepest and furthermost one that was into the woods. If you kept going after our ranch, you'd only see thick woods and eventually reach a military base after a few hours near the end of the county. This is a general picture of what the land looks like that I made in MS Paint just to keep things simple. This is not only my tale, but it's also my dad's and my Uncle Doug. I will begin with the events that I experienced firsthand along with my sister and grandfather, then the ones that my dad experienced, and finally with events experienced by my Uncle Doug. They all happen in chronological order, and only I came to learn about what Dad and Uncle Doug had seen a long time later. They both had their experiences individually, and Uncle Doug was the one most affected. To this day, he will not talk about it, and he only talks about what happened to him after a few packs of beer. To begin, well, I guess it really begins with my mom. Mom comes from a weird family, weird in the good and funny kind of way most of the time. Her dad was a, quote, adventurer, the kind of dude that had a cowboy lifestyle and traveled all over the country doing all kinds of stuff. Granddad saw and did a lot of things. He even once claimed to have killed a werewolf and skinned him to make a leather jacket, and the jacket was weird looking, so we all believed him, even though the story probably wasn't true. The thing is, even being a wacky trickster type Granddad had actually seen some stuff, and he sometimes pointed it out in a rather gloomy way. Grandmother, on the other hand, came from a Romanian family, and she was part gypsy. Both Granddad and Grandma believed stupidly in the supernatural, whether because of Granddad's experiences or the stuff they both saw. This rubbed off on my mom, so not only was my mom stupidly superstitious, she also claimed to be paranormal sensitive. For instance, she would tell us that when they first moved to the ranch, she'd hear hooves and chains walking all over the roof. She'd tell us about a nicely dressed man that sometimes sat on a log beside our house smoking a cigarette, only to walk away and to vanish whenever anyone approached, and many other stories of that nature. My dad, of course, never experienced or saw any of this, so he would chalk it up as my mom telling us horror stories. Mom was also a horror movie or book aficionado, and Uncle Doug would laugh as he never saw it either. Granddad and Grandma, on the other hand, would nod, even though they themselves said that they didn't see those things either. Thanks to all this talk, me and my sister were always creating fictional monsters and stuff like that to mess with each other. I don't deny, the first place that we lived in was spooky, as were all the wooden areas, but we got used to it. After all, we lived there. It wasn't until we were about 6 or 7 that we had our first incident. Dad and Uncle Doug had started clearing a big patch of high grass that was directly behind our homes. There had been a string of break-ins at a few neighboring ranches, and since Uncle Doug, whose cabin was the closest to the high grass, had a bunch of expensive car parts in his garage, Uncle Doug owned a car repair shop and liked custom cars. They figured that it was best to clear this high grass right up to the tree line so that nobody could approach our homes at night, especially unconcealed. It took them a few days, but on the first day they had already got a big part of it done. It was the late afternoon. Me and my sister were playing outside in the yard, with a front view of Uncle Doug's cabin, and henceforth the woods and the high grass. We were waiting for our parents to get ready because we were going to go into town to watch Harry Potter. So me and my sister were doing kid stuff when my sister stops dead in her tracks and starts looking at the high grass. She points. I turn to look and I see this figure standing there, motionless. It was against the sun, so all we could see was its outline. It was big, and it looked vaguely like a person, but yet, from the distance, it also seemed to look like a big dead tree, but we never remembered having seen a tree stump there. We were staring at this person-like silhouette when my sister and I both got unnerved, I guess. We ran to our porch and asked one another what the hell it was. That's when we hear the sound of grass parting, and then footsteps from the tall grass. We yelled and ran inside at the same time. Dad comes out with his shotgun, so does Uncle Doug. We then tell them about the figure and then about the footsteps. They go to investigate. Dad sees nothing and goes back inside. Uncle Doug, though, spends a while looking around, thinking it might have been a possible robber. He also finds nothing and eventually goes back to whatever it was he was doing. Me and my sis chalk it up to as the wind or something like that, an optical illusion. Later that night, we're in our room. We shared a room as kids, as our house wasn't exactly big then. We were up late, talking about the Harry Potter movie, and how we want to go to Hogwarts and stuff, when we hear this wet thump on the window. We look at each other. Maybe it was the cat. It sometimes did that from the inside. Maybe the cat was locked outside and was doing that to try and get in. So Sis pulls back the drapes to look and jumps back as if she received a huge shock. There, on the window, was a pale, fleshy, wet hand just laying against the glass. Whoever the hand belonged to was out of sight. It was crouching down low and we couldn't see it. We stood there for a few minutes until the hand started tapping its fingers on the glass. My sister was brave enough to jump and pull the drapes closed again at that point. We sat there terrified for a while until we heard muffled laughter coming from outside, and then came the sound of somebody pulling the window up. I think screaming too much makes you zone out, because all I remember happening next is grandfather kicking our door in, shotgun in hand, and turning white when he looked at the drapes, which now fluttered in the wind thanks to the open window. My grandfather regains his composure, moves towards the window, fires a shot outside and yells, "I'm calling the police." Sometime later, the police eventually arrive. I look around with my dad and Uncle Doug, and once again, we find nothing. Granddad refuses to describe who or what he saw, just grunting and nodding whenever asked. Granddad never told us what he had seen. From the door, he must have had a good look at it, as it pulled the window all the way up. He installed deadbolts on the windows and told us to make sure that those are locked. A couple days later, I'm sitting in my Uncle Doug's chair, watching him and my dad cut down the high grass, when out of the edge of the woods, I spot what seems to be some white-furred animal sprinting toward my dad. It was huge. I could not make out the details, but I could see the top of its back and the grass parting in front of it, white and furry. I stand up and yell at the top of my lungs. My first thought was that it was a bear of some kind, and that it was charging my dad. Dad looks up at me confused, not making out anything that I'm saying. He turns around, looks around, and comes over. The grass is now still. There's no sign of the animal that was charging just a minute ago. I start telling him about it, and he just looks at me saying, "Uh-huh," and goes back to work. He never thought there was an animal, and just presumed that I was scared and imagining things. It wasn't until years later that my dad would tell me just what he had seen, just a day after that one. It was late afternoon. The sun had already gone down, and Dad was out clearing the last patch of high grass, right up in the tree line. He was nearly done when he started noticing what he described as a thick, copperish smell. At first, he thought it was a grass trimmer that he was using that was malfunctioning or something, but even after turning it off, the smell kept getting stronger. He looked around for the source of it, and directly behind him, standing in the shadow of the tree line, was what looked to be a person. He could only make out its outline, but it was a human silhouette. It was clearly a man, bare-chested, standing with his arms half open at his sides. What was off about it was that it appeared to have either horns or what looked like tree branches sprouting out from behind his head. Dad yelled for whoever was there to show themselves, or to F off his property. The figure stood there and said nothing, and Dad noticed that it seemed to close the distance quite fast without actually moving. Dad had the bladed grass trimmer that was gas-powered instead of the corded version, so he heaved it up over his head and prepared to use it as a weapon if he needed to. He once again yelled for whatever it was to get off the property and started calling for my Uncle Doug. In that moment, he states that the thing simply turned its back to him and quickly ran towards the woods, seemingly without actually doing anything. It made what he described as an animalistic trumpeting sound just before it disappeared. My dad walked back home and tried to figure out what it was. He ended up concluding that he must have just been exhausted, that it must have been just a person that was on the property that he scared off, and he imagined the rest. What was also interesting to note is that the smell vanished as soon as the thing ran away. It became stronger, according to my dad, as it was advancing, and then instantly vanished along with the thing once it ran away. Now, for Uncle Doug's bit, who happens to be the one who had the longest incident with whatever this was. Let me describe Uncle Doug a bit first, though. Obviously, Doug is a fictitious name. Uncle Doug was your usual lumberjack-looking dude, tall as sin, big bushy beard, built like a brick shithouse, and somewhat with a gut, but still intimidating. Uncle Doug was the honey badger of the family, as in, he didn't care. The man was the kind of guy that could run his own hand with a screwdriver, and then be the type to have a beer with the thing still in his hand. Uncle Doug was tough, is what I'm getting at. One day, after my dad had this experience, Uncle Doug was out in the woods for whatever reason. He had his gun and his dog with him. He had spent most of the day doing outdoor survivalist stuff, and I do believe he intended to camp out that day because he had brought a tent and a sleeping bag with him. It's about 5, and Doug is preparing to set up camp for the night. He's in the process of getting a fire started and setting his tent when he starts feeling off, weird, like he's not alone out there in the woods. And guess what? The same copperish metallic smell that my dad smelled just a few days before. Doug actually described it as a smell that you get when you heat up a piece of iron with a blowtorch, or like when you put on clothes that grew ironed with an iron that ran too long and too hot. The smell goes on for about an hour as Doug sets up camp. He's scratching his head, trying to figure out just where the smell's coming from. All the while, it's getting progressively stronger. When his dog starts losing it, it starts barking and recoiling in fear at the same time. Doug goes over to calm him down and nearly gets his hand bitten off. He starts yelling at the dog to quiet down when he notices that there's someone standing in front of them, just far away enough to be barely visible in the light from the fire. In that light, he could only see its lower half up to its waist, and it appears to be a naked woman. At first, Doug thought that it had been some woman who got lost or kidnapped into the woods by some crazy rednecks, and his first thought was offering help. But the way his dog was freaking out makes him too keep his distance. He asks her if she is okay, and gets no response. He asks again, and she starts heaving in response. He grabs his gun from the ground, and when he turns back to look at the woman, she is suddenly way closer. Now he can fully see her. She's completely naked and not injured at all as far as he can tell. She's staring and smiling at him. Doug is getting creeped out and tries to touch her shoulder, only to find her back in the place she was at first. He never even saw her move. Doug talks to her again, and she still remains silent. She won't answer. Doug decides to leave and starts kicking his stuff together. He turns for a moment to get the dog's chain from where he tied it, and in the minute he turns back, she's right in his face. He backs away, tugging at the chain to get the dog close to him, but once he turns to look again, she's nowhere to be seen. Doug decides to book it, taking only his dog, the gun, and the flashlight. It's about 7 and completely dark. Doug is walking in the woods, flashing the light in all directions, with the dog still freaking out, and the metallic smell still extremely strong and very present. He keeps seeing a shaky silhouette in the corner of his vision, edging closer and closer, but nothing is there as soon as he shines the light over it. The smell is still there, and he starts hearing something. Muffled voices, as if somebody is trying to talk to him, far behind him. Further down the trail, he starts hearing heavy thumping, some kind of sound, as if a bull is charging him. He turns quickly, and something slams him in the chest. All the air goes out of his lungs, and he loses the chain, and the dog just abandons him. Scrambling to his feet, he hears the thumping, circling him, and, getting the gun and the light, he scrambles up a tree. The smell is still unbearably strong, and Doug can hear the impatient thumping at the base of the tree. He reaches a branch large enough to sit, and fires 2 shots, down at random. The thumping dies down, and Doug starts scanning the area with the flashlight. There's nothing to be seen, anywhere. No trace of what happened to him. A few minutes pass. The voices come back. They're really far away, and then they seem to surround him. Then they go down to the base of the tree. Doug keeps scanning the area and flashes the trail where he came from, only this time to see the figure of the woman, but this time she has her back turned to him. She is shaking and jerking her limbs in weird, quick motions, almost like she's having a seizure standing up. She begins to laugh hysterically, and Doug swears it sounds more like a goat making a trumpet sound than a laugh. He stays up there for the entire night. The smell starts to die down at about 2 a.m., and as the sun is coming up, it's vanished. However, he waits until almost midday before even considering coming down. The shotgun's in his hand. He doubles back to his campsite, only to find his tent and sleeping bag torn to shreds and completely destroyed, also looking like as if something trampled it several times. Doug books it to the ranch and doesn't tell anyone what had happened. He says the dog simply ran away, which at the time we believed to be true because we never saw the dog again. And then he said that he had fallen down a creek. Later that day, my dad comes to talk to him and asks him why he came back in the middle of the night, only to then leave and head back out again. Apparently, Doug had returned at about 3 a.m., called my dad from the yard in a super deep voice, and asked if the kids were okay. He then stood there in the shadows for a few long moments before sauntering to his cabin. Dad thought he had left early in the morning to go back for his stuff. Dad had assumed that Doug was drunk and thought nothing of it. Doug, however, was still up, sitting in the tree during that time, which makes us ask ourselves the question, who the hell had been standing there in the yard, asking about us and sounding like Doug? Doug said nothing, although later admitted that he had never felt so scared about anything in his entire life, and never ventured deep into those woods ever again. 2 years later, we moved to Dallas, and nobody said anything or put 2 and 2 together until years later when we got together for a big family reunion when I was home from college. We all sat talking about our old ranch home. Everyone was scared shitless of it, and I still feel uneasy talking about it, especially at the old ranch. So what do you think this family encountered in the woods on their land? Something that can take so many shapes and seemingly sound so many different ways. What exactly do you think it was? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and enjoy this type of video, please like and subscribe. I post 3 times a week, all about this type of topic and the paranormal. If you would like to support the channel, there's links in the description to a PayPal and a Patreon. If you want to support the channel on YouTube, there are super thanks and memberships, and a new hype feature that I believe helps your channel get kind of promoted more by the YouTube algorithm, or that's what I've been told anyways. So, if you would like to use one of your hypes on one of my videos, I would be very grateful. And, as usual, thank you for pulling up a stump with me. Thank you for watching, and have a good week.